In American military history, only one U.S. Army fort was ever captured by Apache warriors. Fort Buchanan, February 17, 1865. 9 soldiers against 75 Chiricahua fighters. No reinforcements, no escape route. As flames consumed the garrison, Sergeant Buckley faced an impossible choice. Surrender meant certain torture, while fleeing meant charging through a wall of warriors. The desperate decision that followed would be deliberately omitted from military records, a shameful defeat America chose to forget. In southern Arizona on February 17, 1865, William Ritson and Gilbert W. Hopkins traveled by mule from Fort Tuac toward Fort Buchanan. The 2 businessmen, working as surveyors for the U.S. Federal Land Office, were accompanied by an unnamed Mexican assistant. Their journey through the rugged terrain came at great personal risk, a fact they understood but perhaps underestimated. The Arizona Territory in 1865 existed in a state of constant tension. Travel between settlements required courage, bordering on recklessness, as Chiricahua Apache warriors maintained consistent control of the region beyond U.S. military outposts. The conflict that would eventually lead to the fall of Fort Buchanan had roots dating back to 1861, when U.S. military authorities accused Chief Cochise and his Chiricahua tribe of kidnapping a young boy. This accusation spiraled into what became known as the Bascom Affair, igniting a decade-long bloody conflict. Despite suffering defeat at the Battle of Apache Pass several years earlier, Cochise commanded a formidable fighting force. Under his leadership, Apache raiders attacked settlements, stagecoaches, and isolated travelers regularly throughout southern Arizona. The U.S. military struggled to contain these fast-moving, tactically superior warriors who knew the landscape intimately. Fort Buchanan itself came into existence as a direct response to expanding American territorial ambitions. After the United States acquired southern Arizona through the Gadsden Purchase of 1854, military planners recognized the strategic need for a central fortification between Fort Yuma and the Rio Grande Valley. This outpost would serve dual purposes, protecting the growing number of American settlers while securing transportation routes through hostile territory. The first attempt at establishing a military presence in the region came in November 1856, when a temporary installation called Camp Moore was built near Calabasas, Arizona, modern-day Rio Rico. This preliminary effort lasted only a few months before military authorities recognized its tactical limitations. By May 1857, Army engineers selected a more defensible location near the headwaters of Sonoita Creek. They relocated the garrison and officially named it Fort Buchanan in honor of then-President James Buchanan. The fort quickly grew beyond its military function, becoming an important commercial hub for the surrounding region as settlers and merchants gathered under its protection. When the Civil War erupted in 1861, the fort's significance suddenly shifted. Military commanders worried about the questionable loyalties of local residents and the potential for Confederate forces to capture the installation. Rather than risk losing valuable supplies and equipment to Southern sympathizers, Union officers ordered Fort Buchanan abandoned. Soldiers burned everything they couldn't transport with them. Confederate militia units arrived at the site in 1862, finding only charred ruins where the fort once stood. Their occupation was brief and largely symbolic, as the strategic value of the position had diminished without proper facilities. Later that same year, Union troops from the California Column reclaimed the area, establishing an intermittent presence at Fort Buchanan. For the next several years, soldiers occupied the rebuilt fort sporadically, often leaving it understaffed or completely unmanned for extended periods. This irregular occupation created vulnerable gaps in the military's territorial control, weaknesses that Cochise and his warriors observed and ultimately exploited. By February 1865, Fort Buchanan represented not a stronghold of American military power, but rather a fragile outpost teetering on the edge of disaster. The 9 soldiers stationed there, led by Sergeant Buckley, had no way of knowing that Ritson, Hopkins, and their Mexican assistant were traveling toward the fort, or that their journey would trigger one of the most complete military defeats in the history of the Apache Wars. As Ritson, Hopkins, and their Mexican assistant traversed the rugged hillside terrain on February 17, 1865, they remained unaware they were being tracked. The three men followed a well-worn path from Fort Tuac toward Fort Buchanan, their mules navigating the rocky landscape at a steady pace. The attack came suddenly. Dozens of Chiricahua Apache warriors who had positioned themselves in the surrounding brush and behind rock formations unleashed a coordinated volley of rifle fire and arrows. The first shot struck the mules, sending the animals stumbling. The three men dismounted quickly, disoriented by the sudden violence. "Fort Buchanan!" Hopkins shouted, pointing toward the distant military outpost. The three men abandoned their downed mules and supplies, running frantically toward what they believed would be their salvation. The warriors pursued them across the rugged terrain, keeping enough distance to continue firing, but close enough to maintain pursuit. What followed was a desperate race across several miles of exposed territory. The surveyors and their assistant had no weapons capable of holding off their pursuers. Military reports later documented that the men made no defensive stand, with no return gunfire heard by soldiers at the fort. Their only strategy was to reach the perceived safety of Fort Buchanan. The three men nearly succeeded. They had closed to within visual distance of the fort's walls when the Apache warriors finally overtook them. Ritson fell first, followed quickly by Hopkins and the Mexican assistant. The warriors surrounded the bodies, collecting weapons and valuables before continuing toward the fort itself. In the military investigation that followed, Sergeant Buckley made a startling admission. He had no knowledge that Ritson and Hopkins were even in the area. No communication had reached Fort Buchanan about their planned arrival, leaving the garrison completely unprepared to provide covering fire or send a rescue party when the attack began. This communication failure resulted in a catastrophic unintended consequence. The three men's desperate flight unwittingly led dozens of Chiricahua warriors directly to Fort Buchanan's doorstep. What might have been a tragic but isolated ambush of travelers instead became the prelude to the only successful Apache capture of a U.S. military installation. The deaths of Ritson and Hopkins did not go unrecognized in Arizona's history. The two highest peaks in the Santa Rita Mountains were later named Mount Ritson and Mount Hopkins in their honor, standing as permanent geographical memorials to the men who died within sight of what they thought would be their salvation. The unnamed Mexican assistant, however, received no such recognition, his contribution and sacrifice largely forgotten in official historical accounts. The three bodies, riddled with arrows and bullets, lay in the open terrain as the Apache warriors turned their attention to the 9 soldiers inside Fort Buchanan, who remained completely unaware of the advancing threat. Following the ambush of Ritson, Hopkins, and their assistant, the Chiricahua warriors turned their attention to Fort Buchanan itself. The fort's garrison consisted of just 9 members of the 1st California Cavalry Regiment, woefully inadequate for the attack they were about to face. Sergeant Buckley sat on the porch of the guardhouse, unaware of the impending danger. 5 privates rested inside the main building, while 2 others worked in the fields cutting grass for the horses. Private George English had left earlier that morning on a hunting expedition, having received permission to supplement the fort's dwindling food supplies. The attack began with remarkable stealth. A single Chiricahua warrior crept close to the guardhouse, raised his rifle, and fired at Sergeant Buckley. The bullet struck Buckley in the thigh, sending him sprawling backward. Despite his injury, Buckley managed to draw his sidearm and return fire, killing his attacker. This exchange of gunfire alerted the soldiers inside the building, who rushed to take defensive positions. "We're under attack!" Buckley shouted as he crawled through the guardhouse door, leaving a trail of blood behind him. The sergeant joined his men inside just as the full scale of their predicament became apparent. Approximately 75 Apache warriors had surrounded the fort, taking positions behind rocks, trees, and the remains of outer buildings. The soldiers barricaded the doors and windows of the main building, returning fire whenever they spotted movement. This defensive posture initially kept the attackers at bay, but the Apache warriors soon changed tactics. Several warriors began launching flaming arrows onto the wooden roof of the fort. Others gathered dry brush and wood, pushing it against the building's outer walls before setting it ablaze. As smoke filled the interior of the fort, Buckley assessed their dire situation. The building would soon become uninhabitable, and their ammunition supplies were limited. The sergeant knew that surrender was not an option. The Chiricahua rarely took prisoners, and those they did capture often faced prolonged torture. Their only chance for survival was to attempt a breakout toward the nearby hills, where they might find cover and possibly rendezvous with patrols from other forts. "When I give the word, we run for the eastern gap," Buckley instructed his men, pointing toward a section of the Apache line that appeared less densely occupied. "Fire as you go. Don't stop for anything." As sections of the roof began collapsing inward, Buckley gave the order. The 6 soldiers burst through the main door, firing their weapons and running in a tight formation toward the eastern perimeter. The Apache warriors, caught by surprise at the sudden emergence of the soldiers, fired a chaotic volley that miraculously killed none of the fleeing men. The soldiers continued their desperate sprint across open ground, drawing fire from all directions. Remarkably, all 6 men reached the foothills without sustaining fatal injuries. The Apache warriors pursued them briefly, but abandoned the chase when the soldiers reached steeper terrain where the tactical advantage shifted to the defenders. Private George English, who had departed on his hunting mission before the attack, was never seen or heard from again. Military records list him as killed in action, though his body was never recovered. The 2 privates who had been cutting grass in the fields when the attack began heard the gunfire and returned toward the fort. Seeing it surrounded by Apache warriors, they wisely retreated into the hills without attempting to rejoin their comrades. They later rejoined their unit at Fort Tuac. Military historians continue to debate whether Chief Cochise personally participated in the attack on Fort Buchanan. No conclusive evidence places him at the scene, though the tactical coordination displayed by the Apache force suggests leadership by someone familiar with military operations. After securing the fort, the Chiricahua collected substantial spoils: 6 horses, 250 rounds of ammunition, 200 rations, 2 carbine rifles, and 6 complete U.S. cavalry uniforms. The warriors then burned what remained of the fort to the ground, erasing the American military presence from that location permanently. The acquisition of cavalry uniforms would later create significant problems for travelers in the region, as Apache warriors occasionally wore these uniforms to approach unwary travelers or small military detachments before launching surprise attacks. This tactic increased the psychological impact of Apache raids, creating uncertainty and fear among soldiers and settlers throughout the Arizona Territory. The day after the attack, Captain John L. Merriam arrived at Fort Buchanan with 25 soldiers, expecting to find a functioning military outpost. Instead, they discovered smoldering ruins and a grim scene of destruction. The bodies of William Ritson, Gilbert Hopkins, and their Mexican assistant lay where they had fallen, just outside the fort's perimeter, their corpses bearing evidence of the violent end they had met. Captain Merriam ordered his men to bury the 3 men in graves near the fort. Military records indicate that Hopkins' remains were later exhumed and transported back to Long Island, New York, where he was reinterred in April 1866. His family had apparently used their connections and resources to ensure he received a proper burial in his home state. The Mexican assistant, whose name went unrecorded in official reports, remained buried in the Arizona soil, his contribution to Western expansion unmarked and unacknowledged. After surveying the extensive damage to Fort Buchanan, Captain Merriam made a practical assessment. The fort's strategic value did not justify the resources required to rebuild it a 3rd time, particularly given the ongoing demands of the Civil War elsewhere. He ordered his detachment to salvage what little remained of value and return to Fort Tuac, effectively abandoning the position. The U.S. military did not entirely withdraw from the region, however. In 1867, 2 years after Fort Buchanan's destruction, Army engineers established Camp Crittenden approximately half a mile east of the original fort site. This new installation featured improved defenses that incorporated lessons learned from the Fort Buchanan disaster, including better sight lines, fewer blind approaches, and more substantial construction. Camp Crittenden stood until 1873, when changing military priorities and the gradual containment of Apache resistance led to its abandonment. A memorial marker at the site commemorates Lieutenant Howard Cushing, who died in 1871 during a battle with Cochise's band. Cushing had gained recognition for his aggressive pursuit of Apache raiding parties and was considered one of the Army's most effective combat leaders in the territory. His death represented a significant loss for military operations against the Chiricahua. Today, nothing remains of Fort Buchanan itself. The land where American soldiers once stood guard has reverted to private ownership, with no visible evidence of its military history. Unlike many other Western forts that have been preserved as historical sites or reconstructed for educational purposes, Fort Buchanan exists primarily in scattered military records and obscure historical texts. This historical amnesia appears deliberate rather than accidental. The U.S. Army, which meticulously documented and celebrated its victories against Native American tribes, showed little interest in commemorating its defeats. Fort Buchanan represented a significant tactical failure, a military installation with trained soldiers overcome by indigenous warriors who lacked formal military training or advanced weapons. While a memorial marker could easily be placed at the site, institutional reluctance to acknowledge military defeats has left this chapter of American history largely untold. The battle holds unique historical significance as the only instance during the Apache Wars when Chiricahua warriors successfully captured a U.S. Army fort. This fact alone should secure its place in military history, yet it remains absent from most textbooks and historical narratives of the American West. The successful tactics employed by the Apache fighters, patient reconnaissance, coordinated attack, and effective use of fire as a weapon, demonstrated their military acumen and adaptability in the face of technologically superior opponents. The deliberate forgetting of Fort Buchanan's fall represents a broader pattern in American historical memory, where military setbacks against indigenous forces often received minimal documentation and public acknowledgement. This selective remembering created a distorted narrative of westward expansion that emphasized American technological and tactical superiority while minimizing the effective resistance mounted by Native American tribes. The story of Fort Buchanan thus serves as both a military case study and a reminder of how historical memory is constructed, with certain events highlighted and others consigned to obscurity based on their alignment with national narratives of progress and power.